Good evening. Welcome to this session on addressing human rights and labor rights in companies using ESG investment strategies and disclosure. My name is Pavan Mehra. I am a managing director at Kinetics, and I will be the moderator for this session. The session has been organized by Oxfam, Fair Finance, and Kinetics. We are going to be focused on why investors care about human rights and labor rights. This is increasingly becoming important to them. And in this 90-minute session, we hope to be focusing on the following themes. First is the relevance of human rights and labor rights in companies to investors. Second, the availability of information to make informed decisions and the reliability of information. What is it and what are the gaps? And we really hope to be focusing with respect to the panel, really trying to figure out how can we address the gaps on reliability and availability of information as we work on human rights and labor rights. So let's move over the slides. Excellent, the slides are moving. I'm delighted to have with me 5 panelists who are very seasoned on this topic. We have with us Arindam Dutta. He is the Executive Director and Head of Development Banking at Rabobank. He has over 28 years of experience in rural finance, cooperative banking, microfinance, and agribusiness banking. Arindam is responsible for the sustainability banking initiatives on knowledge, risk management, and business development. He has previously worked with banks such as NABARD, IDBI Bank, and CARE. And his exemplary work has been awarded the Indian Sustainable Leadership Award in the 2017 India Sustainability Leadership Forum. Also with us today is Bharti Birla. She is the Chief Technical Advisor and Project Manager at the ILO. Bharati has over 25 years of experience in development and corporate sectors in varied corporate capacities, and she is working as the Chief Technical Advisor on 2 ILO projects, the Japan South Asia Project for Safety and Health for All, focused on the plantation sector, and sustainable global supply chains. Bharti possesses extensive experience managing multi-stakeholder programs focused on gender, forced and child labor, trafficking and migration, and global supply chain issues. We also have Pradeep Narayan, who is the Director of Partner in Change and Director of Practice Institute for Participatory Practices. He is also a member of Corporate Responsibility Watch, having spent more than 25 years in corporate, government, and the non-government sector in India, Singapore, and the UK. Namit Agarwal is the Asia Policy Lead at the World Banking Alliance and leads WBA's engagement with the external policy environment in Asia, focusing on issues that advocate long-term sustainable development, finance, and corporate reporting. Before the WBA, Namit worked with Oxfam India, Care India, and Samhita Social Ventures in the area of advocacy, campaigning, program design, and communication. And we also have Sachin Joshi, who is an independent sustainability researcher and consultant who engages with companies and research and advocacy organizations on consulting and research projects across sustainability issues in the value chain for a variety of business models. He has been the policy director at Business 20 during G20 presidency of Saudi Arabia in 2020, and the head of Center of Excellence of the Sustainable Development head of Center of Excellence for Sustainable Development at the Confederation of Indian Industry. We will be hearing from them shortly. And before we get to the panel, I will be spending 15 minutes sharing findings of some of the research work done with our team on how human rights and labor rights are business and investor issues. The study was done over the last year and collected information from companies, investors, and civil society organizations. Let's start by kicking off by looking at what is ESG and how is it related to human rights and labor rights. So ESG refers to the use of environmental, social, and governance information to measure the impact of a company. It includes issues like employee health and safety, child labor, responsible sourcing, and fair wages. Now, these issues vary in importance depending on which sector a company is operating in. The chart that you see below highlights that companies in sectors like mining and metals have a number of issues that are important to them, ranging from employee healthcare and safety to labor relations. Others, like companies in the personal care or food and beverage segments, have issues around responsible sourcing that are more important to them. Constructing this matrix, often called a materiality matrix, is important to help understand which issues are important for what particular company. Now, why should investors care about human rights and labor rights? All of them, as you noticed, and this is from the survey, are concerned about financial risk due to business discontinuity. This could be on account of labor strikes, local community unrest, political repercussions, or a myriad of other reasons that can be traced to violations of human or labor rights in the company or its supply chain. A slightly lesser value is the issue of reputational risk to an investor for having provided capital to a company which is facing issues. The legal cost to a company or to an investor is a third issue. And the last issue is that sometimes by focusing on human and labor rights, investors uncover other unrelated issues. Now, we studied the 35 largest companies in India to see how they fared on disclosure of human rights and labor rights. We selected the largest companies with the belief that they would represent what the leading companies in India are doing. We picked large companies in those sectors where human and labor rights were important. As you can see, the largest share are in the food and beverages and personal care segments, with about 31% of the companies over there, followed by automotive ancillaries with 26% of the companies. And infrastructure and retail have about 14% of the companies each, followed by mining, oil and gas, and chemicals. Now, it's important to bear in mind that we are measuring disclosure. And disclosure is not the same thing as action. However, it is likely that a firm that is proactive in disclosure, a firm that is proactive in measuring disclosure, chances are that it is likely to be acting on it. So to make it real, here are the 35 companies that we studied. And for those of you that are watching that are from India, you will recognize many of these that are familiar names. And many of you that are looking at this from a regional lens, you will see several multinational companies in this list. So we also looked at the largest investors in these 35 companies. And these are insurance companies, global asset managers, a few sovereign wealth funds, and some Indian asset managers. We tried to uncover the lenders as well to these companies, and that data wasn't easy to come by. However, as we will discuss in our panel, lenders also have a key role to play while influencing the companies. So let's look at what we discovered. We'll spend first some time looking at what we discovered when we looked at companies, and then we will look at what the investor view was when we went back to them with the same data. So at an aggregate level, 97% of the companies reported on number of permanent women employees. There's a slight typo in the second, which is 94% of the companies reported on overall permanent employees. 69% of the companies reported and tracked the number of permanent differently abled employees. 69% of the companies extended their human rights policies to all vendors, suppliers, and subsidiaries. 89% of these 35 companies have a recognized employee association, and 63% companies reported complaints of sexual harassment. Now, interestingly, 0% of the companies reported complaints on child labor, forced labor, or discriminatory employment. And only 11% of the companies reported cases on human rights complaints. And then we have data where 69% of the companies reported explicitly stated that employees are covered under collective bargaining agreements. 79% of them stated prohibition of child labor in their code of conduct or having policies in the supply chain were there. And 20% of them stated where companies explicitly had some sort of complete reporting on compliance with minimum wages. Now, we also looked at companies to see how many of them had dedicated policies on human rights. As you can see, the answer varied by sector, but by and large, only about 40% of the leading companies have separate human rights policies. The implication there is that this number is likely to be lower when we go towards smaller companies. Now, sorry if this is a dense slide. It shows how the disclosure on human rights indicators varies by sector. And we have examined disclosure on fair wages in the supply chain, human rights training, how many employees are covered by collective bargaining, reporting on differently abled employees, and a couple of other parameters. The gist of the slide is that there's work that needs to happen even with the largest companies to disclose better. And we're still talking about disclosure. We haven't yet focused on parameters related to action. Now, here we look at the percentage of companies that are reporting for complaints on child labor, discriminatory labor, sexual harassment, and human rights. As I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, no complaints are received for child labor and also no complaints for forced labor or discriminatory labor. Now, these are large companies and they may have good systems in place. And they have also reported, however, on, I think most of the reporting has happened primarily on sexual harassment and some on gender and human rights violations. Now, almost 3/4 of the firms had policies that explicitly prohibited child labor in the supply chain. And there is some variation that goes across sectors, but again, 3/4 having explicit policies for child labor across the supply chain. And so what we've just touched upon is what the largest companies are doing. But what happens when, and this is with respect to the code of conduct that several of them have with respect to suppliers. So what we've just talked about is what the largest companies are doing. But what happens when we speak to investors? So let's have a look at what investors are saying and what's their point of view. So I'm pulling out a quote from one of the investors that seemed to summarize most of the conversations that we had over there. What it says, "We have never believed it is an ethical or good business sense to buy a terrible company and then write ESG engagement letters to a recipient who won't care. We believe in engaging with companies, but we are not so deluded as to think that every company wants to listen. India has many promoter-controlled companies. Some of them are amongst the most ethical people we have encountered. Others are less so, but due to their controlling stakes, we would be telling untruths to clients if we thought we could have any influence." The gist of this message for us was that investors are looking at management of companies that are already predisposed to working on ESG matters. And ESG, once again, is environmental, social, and governance. So, how are these investors incorporating ESG information? First, most of them are proactively assessing them before they invest. That's what you see on the right side of the graph on that's presently visible to you. And then after the investment is made, they have a monitoring process. And if there is a controversy, it triggers an inquiry or some sort of ongoing engagement process. Now, different investors act differently based on the outcome of such an inquiry. Some reduce their ESG scores, and which will reduce their weightage of exposure into that company, and others will divest from such firms. Now, let's look at a different perspective. Earlier, we saw how most companies have separate supplier policies and codes of conduct. But from an investor lens, here's an interesting view, right? Their quote is, just issuing a supplier code of conduct is not sufficient. The actual complexities related to labor or human rights lie in the supply chain. And very few corporates know much about their supply chain. We heard this several times again and again, illustrated with numerous examples. One example that we heard was a supply chain of tea manufacturing companies, which, obviously tea manufacturing is a very complex supply chain. And there are third party certifications like Trust Tea, Rainforest Alliance, so on and so forth, for helping assure responsible sourcing. However, when the third party certifies the sites, the investors are saying that the companies should also have some employees who can uphold the ratings provided by a third party, essentially provide more details about which suppliers are better. They would like information about the suppliers, what's the location, what's being done there, and not from a third party certification entity, but really from the company. What they want to know is, to what extent does the company have traceability? What are the suppliers where the company has taken up initiatives to identify existing and potential negative impacts? So really, investors are seeking that kind of information, and not just to the level of high level disclosure, which presently also I think is rather limited. We also saw, this is a different slant, where we saw earlier how 40% of the leading corporates have separate human rights and human rights policies. And in what investors want to know is, how are they implemented? How are the violations handled? How are suppliers engaged? And all this kind of information is rather limited or unavailable in company disclosures. There's another quote I'm going to pull out, and this quote summarizes an approach that many have had. Now, they recognize the complexity of the journey of engaging an organization on human rights and labor rights, or engaging an extended supply chain, but they want to understand the thoroughness of the process. This quote goes well. The most useful information that we can get from managers of the companies is the implementation roadmap and plan for best practices to be applied in the supply chain. The exhaustiveness of such a roadmap itself speaks a lot to about how serious the company is in terms of extending the human rights or labor rights policies to the supply chain. Now, where investors are seeking, where do investors seek support? Now, investors are doing all this work, but they are also seeking support, and there's a role for several stakeholders to come to the table, including policy. They are looking for more indicators to be included, and they're looking for information to be standardized. They're also looking for more companies to disclose. And as we will discuss in the panel, there are several initiatives underway on these fronts. We also have several multi-stakeholder led efforts underway to advance the disclosure effort. And the disclosure is a prerequisite to substantive coordinated action. Now, thank you for bearing with me for the last 15 minutes. We're going to move on to the panel with that context of how investors are engaging with human rights and labor rights, and discuss some of these issues in detail. The first theme that we're going to touch upon is really the relevance of corporate actions on human rights and labor rights, and how does it connect with investors. And my first question, Arundam, I'm really going to direct it to you as someone who's been on the investor side looking at this for a long time. If you can color for us, in which sectors are human rights and labor rights material issues for you as you're making investment decisions at Rabobank? And how do you anticipate it and how do you plan for it? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Pawan. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be a member in this panel. And Pawan, that was a great presentation you made, very comprehensive, and I think you've addressed most of the issues. Now, to answer your question, first, I work for Rabobank. It's a Dutch cooperative bank, the world's largest bank in food and agribusiness. And importantly, for this discussion, it's been rated and ranked #1 on ESG parameters by Sustainalytics for the last 3 years. That's, I guess, pretty relevant here. So, Pawan, to answer your question now, how do we look at companies before we engage with them on a commercial basis? It's very important to know that what we do is before we do any kind of origination for any asset anywhere in the world, whether it's a corporate asset or it's a retail asset, we first do a sustainability due diligence before we even do the credit due diligence. So we do have a certain format and a certain process through which we have to go through, and that throws up a certain rating and ranking for every potential customer of the bank. And irrespective of credit considerations, if the rating or ranking falls below a threshold, then we do not do business with that particular company. That's very, very important to know. So sustainability comes first, even before we take a credit view for a bank like us. Now, what is it that we do? So first, we look at the sustainability policy, as you mentioned, how comprehensive is the sustainability policy and who owns the sustainability policy. Second is it good? It's not good enough to have a policy, but how do they report on the policy of what's going on, and how do they report on actual implementation of the policy? Number two, that's something you have already mentioned. The third point, again, you have mentioned is how deep in the value chain can the company report on? Extremely important. And I'm talking not only of human rights or labor issues, I'm talking of the comprehensive ESG parameters that we need to do a check on all. So that's what we do. Now, within that, as a food and agribusiness bank, there are certain subsectors where particular aspects of ESG become more important. In this case, human rights, yes, as you mentioned, labor laws, say in plantation. Now, it's very critical to understand how the business happens in a plantation, which is usually in a rural area. There are all kind of labor-related issues without getting into the details. So we are aware of the sectors where there are issues. And that's where we do a special dipstick or a detailed kind of due diligence where required to really find out whether there are sustainability issues, human rights issues, or labor issues, which requires explanations. Now, what happens is there are times when we are willing to do business with a company which may have a very nascent sustainability policy or a new policy, so long as there is a commitment by the business that they have a time-bound kind of an action plan to be able to achieve their sustainability ambitions and goals, say within 3 to 5 years. We are on a conditional basis willing to engage with such companies. The other aspect, which I'll not cover now, is what happens when a client, we find out that within a client which has already been onboarded, issues regarding human rights or labor issues come up. How do we deal with it? I'll deal with that separately, Pawan, at a later time. Thank you.
Thank you, Arindam. Appreciate that color. I'm going to go over to Bharti. If you could color for us, Bharti, from an ILO standpoint, as you see companies and investors, what are important issues that you see that need to be taken into account?
Thanks, Pawan. As everyone is aware, ILO is a United Nations specialized agency which was founded in 1919, and the basic reason why the ILO was established, the basic mandate was to enable decent work for all women and men in conditions of freedom, equality, security, and human dignity. And it's a standard setting organization in the world of work. And from the ILO point of view, we have been talking about decent work, or the four pillars of decent work, which includes employment creation. It includes social protection for workers, rights at work, and social dialogue. Social dialogue basically means the tripartite partners, the employers, workers, and governments sit together and discuss about how progressively they can make work more decent. Having said that, for the ILO, there are core ILO conventions which look at freedom of association and collective bargaining. We have conventions that deal with elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor, abolition of child labor, and elimination and discrimination in respect of employment and occupation, which we also call as core fundamental conventions. Apart from that, from the point of view of the ILO and the response of the UN, we also have different instruments or international standards and instruments which have been in place for a long time in the context of human rights and business. The first one of them was in 1977. It was much ahead of its time in the form of MNE Declaration, which was the ILO tripartite declaration of principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy. We also had 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. We have, Declaration on Fair Globalization, apart from the UN Global Compact, which is also guiding these principles, and the UN Business and Human Rights Framework and Guiding Principles that came out in 2011. We also have OECD guidelines. All of these focus on the issues related to sustainability, related to the responsibilities, which are important not just for the businesses, but also for the investors. We know that the focus on human rights in business has been increasing. It is a growing concern of the civil society. It is a growing concern of the public, of the private actors, and also from the investment point of view. And socially responsible businesses are critical. What we also see is that many times, these instruments or these initiatives, whether they are international or intergovernmental organizational initiatives like the UN initiatives or multi-stakeholder initiatives or international framework agreements, national and cross-regional legislative initiatives, sectoral initiatives, or even enterprise-led initiatives. Many of these measures sometimes do not reach, for example, the lower tiers of the supply chain. And in South Asian economies, for example, there is changing nature of work and labor that is happening. We see a lot of change. We see situations of distress. We see weak regulating capacities and weak legislation in these countries. So the question is, how do we look at the issues of business and human rights, not just from the point of labor rights, but also from the point of corporate governance? And ILO has been saying that, we need to have focus on labor rights, not just from the human rights perspective, but also from the business ethics perspective, and also look at how much risk is there on the enterprise if we do not follow these. So, for example, any incidents of infringement or lapses not only breach the fundamental rights and principles at work, but also can bring significant material consequences, loss of reputation, increased cost, and damages to relationships which companies and businesses have with stakeholders and customers. So the question for the ILO has been, how do we create impact which is sustainable and creates sustainable value along the supply chain? And focusing attention on human and labor rights, helps avoiding a big business risk for the corporations as well as the investors. And the long-term investors certainly won't like to take this immense risk, because it can create issues related to reputational risk, damages, and what we really need is a cycle of effective social dialogue between different stakeholders, offering better conditions to workers, enabling enterprise productivity, increased consumer demand, and more better jobs uh, for the future. So I think from the ILO's point of view, we need to focus on the risks to people and how we can mitigate these risks, and this can also help better investments. Thank you.
Thank you for those thoughts, Bharati. I think it amplifies the point that Arindam made with respect to the risk aspect, and I think the other point that you also highlighted it from an ILO standpoint, it's not just about coming up with guidances, but it's also really about business ethics, or the focus on business ethics is a lens that ILO is looking at, really with the lens of how do you make impact that is sustainable, and I think that impact that is sustainable is really the key, the operative component here. And I think with that, I'm going to go to Sachin. I think, Sachin, if you don't mind, would love, I mean, this is really a build up towards an area that you've been working in. And so we've been hearing ESG all this while, and you pick up the newspaper almost every day these days, there's some discussion on ESG. How do you go beyond ESG as a buzzword? And with in your experience, as you've engaged in with both the corporate sector as also broadly in the space, what's your experience having worked with analyzing corporate action? How do you make ESG real and not just leave it as a buzzword?
Right. So first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm really delighted to participate and share my thoughts. And you are correct. ESG has certainly become a buzzword, especially in the pandemic year. We've seen ESG investments around the world really shoot up compared to the previous years. And particularly when we see it from India, even some of the retail investors have started to ask about ESG. So that's a positive development. When otherwise, it was looking like the world was going to collapse and come to an end. So that's good news. The very important point that you raised is how do we go beyond making it a buzzword? And the answer to that, of course, is mainstream. Mainstreaming is the way to go. When it becomes a norm, it becomes less of a buzzword. And there are three complementary measures that I propose, would be required. One is ESG needs to be integrated into the business strategy and decision making. I've seen this during my work in so many years with the private sector that the companies that have seriously and honestly integrated ESG, especially the material issues, to their business strategies and the decision making, they have been more resilient, more competitive, as compared to the others in the market. And that is why, it is not very surprising, which also sort of was reflecting in your very specific study, was that around the world and India also, we keep referring to the same companies, the usual suspects, because they were the ones who really embedded or wove ESG or sustainability into the strategy operation. So that's one. The other measure would be integrating it into the investment strategy, like the one that Arindam was talking about. So how do the investors start embedding that into their investment decisions as well? In India, of course, we are really at the infancy. There are isolated examples like the one we have today, who have really been looking at it with a serious scanner. ESG investments and the green investments have, of course, increased, but that's just a part of the larger financial markets and the projects. And unfortunately, what has happened is that there's an added rush to the greener part of ESG, as if the social part was less sexy and less important. Perhaps then it becomes the responsibility of people like us, to really flag that issue and make that important as well. And the third measure would be to integrate it into the policy making. That is, that almost every policy of the government be looked at for the trade-offs and any unintended ESG consequences. So these would be the three measures, how to move beyond the buzzword. But before I end, I would just like to also flag that around the world, economies are in rapid transition, notably because of digitalization, automation, and decarbonization of their economies, which is having fundamental shifts in employment and employability as well. So this is a huge human rights concern. Partly alluded to it, but I don't think that both the companies as well as the investors are still, or they have figured out, what to do about it and how to look at it and make their own assessments about it. Thank you.
Thank you for the start, Sachin. That is helpful. I think the point of mainstreaming as a solution towards, obviously, not just buzzword, and mainstreaming from a point of strategy, investments, as also policy. I think those are three important lenses. And I think the role of the government, obviously, is from multiple facets, whether from a policy standpoint, but also I think the government also is an investor. And I think, Pradeep, this is where I want to bring you in. I know you all have looked at that lens of the government as an investor, and you all have written a very interesting report that looked at the government's role. And India also has, obviously, several large public sector units as well. So can you share from your perspective and the analysis that you all carried out, how is human rights and keep the role of government as policy different, but how is human rights relevant or important to government as an investor?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I think there are two things which I wanted to add to it. I think one is the government as a regulator and the government as as investor. From the regulation side, even when we did as a corporate responsibility watch, when we did the analysis of the business responsibility report, some of the findings which you had presented, which aligns with those things. But in addition to that, I think some key findings which I think as a government, as a regulator, and government as an investor, how they can actually interact with each other would probably come out with some of those findings. And some findings are like, if you see the period from 2017-18 to 19-20, the contractual workforce has grown from has grown by a rate which is 3 times that of the permanent workforce for the top 300 companies, what they have stated in the business responsibility report. Similarly, if you see, 48% of companies have less than 1% representation of people with disabilities. 50% firms have less than 10% women. And if you see the top listed, 10 private companies, if you see the caste configuration of their board members, of the 83 members for which we can locate the caste, 77 belong to just 4 communities: Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya. None from Dalit or Adivasi. And the top paid executive of 5 companies earned more than 500 times the median salary of their company's permanent employee. So if you see, these are some of the areas which are not necessarily at this point of time in a proper regulatory scenarios of the government. And these are something which is definitely, yes, part of the ESG, which should probably come into the regulatory domain. But even before, if they getting into the regulation domain, if you see government as a public investor, we all know the case of the Norwegian ethics ethics council, because of which the Norwegian government has actually almost 13 companies. They have 13 Indian companies. They have I would say they have said that they have divested from 13 Indian companies. Of the 13, if you see, 5 are from the are those companies which have more than 30% operation related to thermal coal. 4 are for the environment case, and 2 for tobacco, and 3 for human rights violation, 2 for nuclear weapons, and 2 for corruption related things. And of these 13, 4 are actually public sector undertakings, and another 4 are MNCs with their operations in India. And this was done by the government of Norway as through its ethics council. Now, similarly, if you look at the investment pattern of the largest public sector company, which is LIC, whose shareholding in companies is at an all-time high now, at around rupees 7 lakh crores, it has shareholding in ITC, which is around 16.1%. And there is a case pending in the Supreme Court now related to the human right to health on whether LIC could invest in tobacco company. And similarly, LIC holding shareholdings is now in Larsen and Toubro, Adani Ports, Tata Steel, and Reliance. If the government invests in making LIC a model ESG investor, it would ensure that the companies that LIC invests is also has a potential to become an ESG compliant. But then the question is that how to build the government here in this sense as an investor. So that's why we saw the opportunity in the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which Ministry of Corporate Affairs is evolving, where we are we as a different organizations, we came together and we are pushing some guidelines, which is primarily to suggest that investment guidelines of the government of India, as well as the procurement guidelines of the government of India, should be very clearly be able to integrate the human rights dimension into it, and so that there is a way by which the government as an investor could actually promote human rights compliance in the sector. I'll stop here. Thank you.
No, thank you, Pradeep. Those examples are particularly helpful, and I think really brings home the point that the government as an investor has a key role to play. We usually think of the government more from a policy standpoint, but clearly, whether it is from the LIC lens and therefore the largest insurance company and the assets they own, or even the public sector undertakings, I think those are very useful examples and data points. So we've touched so far upon the government as an investor. We've looked at the lending aspects. We've looked at the some of the aspects that Sachin and Bharti have brought out on how some of the multi-stakeholder platforms are working towards integrating ESG towards making a more sustainable business, or working towards a more sustainable business. Now, all of this cannot be done unless there is some standardization of information, or some way to compare information. And this is where, Namit, I'd love to bring you in. Would love to hear from you. What are emerging standards, frameworks, initiatives, or guidelines? You've been working in this space for so long, and I know you have been intimately involved with several of them. And not only from your current role at the World Benchmarking Alliance, would learn to understand what the WBA is doing in the space, but even from your prior experience, if you can color, what are these emerging standards, frameworks that we can use on to exchange information in some standardized manner?
Thanks, Pawan, for inviting me here. And the presentation was really eye-opening. Thanks for the presentation as well. So first of all, I think in my role at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and this is a multi-stakeholder alliance, and we have more than 240 organizations who are part of this alliance. We work at the intersection of business responsibility and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And as many of you would know that we have just 10 years remaining for the SDGs to be accomplished, and the Asia region and the South Asia region is definitely not doing well. And in fact, post-pandemic, we have seen that instead of progressing on those indicators and targets, Asia as a region is going backward. So that's a really sign of crisis. And therefore, last year, WBA announced that this decade of action, as the UN has called it out, we said that this decade should be a decade of transparency revolution, so that organizations like ours and many of the others can measure what is the corporate contribution to SDGs and how can we hold them more accountable. One of the things that we focus on, and you alluded to that, Pawan, was looking at some sort of harmonization and coherence in the various policy frameworks, standards, reporting frameworks that are coming out. Fortunately, what we have seen in recent times that there is more and more action throughout the world on corporate disclosures and ESG, starting from the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is kind of setting a very, very high benchmark on what corporate sustainability reporting should look like, and is getting other European countries to also have their act together. Recently, the International Financial Reporting Standards, or IFRS, is also promoting sustainability reporting standards at a global level. And I think Sachin, I think, alluded to the point around mainstreaming. And the fact that an organization like IFRS is supporting something on sustainability and reporting standards brings us closer to that. Pradeep talked about the Indian regulatory environment with the National Action Plan, but also the recent revisions of the National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct and the reporting framework. And it's also about broadly in Asia. Many of the ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries have already developed their ESG taxonomies and frameworks. Others are in the process. Japan and China are both in the process of having stronger corporate governance code and ESG frameworks. What is missing in all of these actions in different countries and regions is these are all, in some sense, isolated, focusing very much on their own context. And what we feel is missing is a globally accepted sustainability framework that can bind all of these efforts. We acknowledge and understand that national and regional context is very important, and we cannot have a common standard globally, which will work for, say, the global North countries or the global South countries. But there has to be certain minimum that is common across the world. And we also believe that the Sustainable Development Goals is by far the world's best business plan for sustainability. All the UN member states have accepted the SDGs and are reporting and perhaps also acting on delivering on the SDGs. We are positioning ourselves, WBA, as an accountability mechanism to measure how the business around the world are contributing to the SDGs. And we are assessing 2,000 of the world's most influential companies on 7 systems transformation. We believe that if we are to bring about large-scale change, look at delivering the SDGs by 2030, incremental change will not happen, will not make it happen. We need to be transformational in our approach, in our approach towards sustainability. And therefore, we have identified these 7 systems transformations. And we can visualize this, our approach of the 7 transformations, as 3 tiers of a circle. And we put the social transformation at the center. And we believe that all companies, irrespective of the sector and the scale, etc., need to comply with certain core social indicators. And we start assessing these 2,000 companies on these social indicators. Then we apply some of the other transformations, for example, the climate, food, digital, as a second tier. And depending on what are their sectoral materiality in that sense, and then applying some of those indicators. And then finally, looking at the financial sector and investors, how do we hold some of the financial institutions accountable? and what is the influence that they have on the companies in which they invest. Doing that, I think one of the main roles that my department, which is the policy department, is playing is to engage with governments and other policy makers in trying to see how can governments and policy action ensure that the policy environment is conducive to bring about some sort of standardization. And right now, there is a lot of debate going on in regions, in countries to bring about some sort of a coherence. And this shows that when you look at corporate action or even financial flows, they go beyond borders. Supply chains are obviously global and go beyond borders. The pandemic has shown the vulnerabilities of these existing systems. Therefore, governments are better placed at this moment to acknowledge that there has to be some level of harmonization of standards so that if one country is bringing about very, very strict norms, whether on human rights, due diligence, or mandatory policies, how does it relate to a part of its supply chain which is in a country or in a region which does not have very strict measures? So I think right now is the best time to push for harmonization, and the fact that we are not doing well as a region, as a world on sustainable development goals, gives us that opportunity to push for a framework which is very widely accepted. I'll stop here, Pawan.
Thank you, Namit. I think that I mean the fact that we've been missing out on the SDGs is obviously a sad state of affairs. But I hear your point that with respect to the lens that WBA is taking on, how do you aim this as a decade of transformation and sort of drive a process through which you can get some sort of a globally accepted framework by agreeing on some minimum common requirements. Yeah, I concur with you. I think the minimum common requirements are a need, not just even from an investor standpoint. I'm sure Arindam and Sachin and Pradeep will also color this aspect where investors, I mean, they are looking across geographies. It's not just India-specific investors. Several investors are looking across geographies, and they do want to make sure that companies are, when we're saying human rights or labor rights or whatever issues we're talking about, it's the same language being applied in different geographies. So having some minimum common lens is one way to move towards that. I'm going to shift gears, and Arindam, I'm going to request you again. I know you left off your first comment by sharing that you'll share what happens, what if companies don't meet the objective. So, would love to hear from you if norms that you have set for companies, if they don't meet, what happens, and if you don't mind, even if I'm putting you on the spot, if you could share examples of where you might have been caught surprised and what you all may have done. I don't think we can hear.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah.
Okay.
The organizers had muted me. Now I guess you can hear me. Now, to make one blanket statement, it's not acceptable. What does that mean? When it's not acceptable, when something comes to our knowledge that there's been a violation of the core sustainability policy, whether it's regarding human rights or any other policy, uh, 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 there's a very serious discussion that happens between our bank and the management of the company on whether they are aware and what action is being taken. If the explanation and the action being taken is not acceptable for us, it's a simple exit for us. We move away from that business. We stop doing business with that company. If the explanation is acceptable and the action being taken is time bound and they can prove that there's concrete action being taken, we continue that relationship, but we kind of monitor that action extremely closely. That's what we do. Now, other than this, I would like to flag two concerns which came up, from a lot of earlier speakers. Now, in the Indian context, now, I would like to see an analysis of Indian companies which has its entire supply chain in India and where it has only local investors and local banks as to how strong their sustainability policies are and actions are. Why I'm saying it is The moment the supply chains become global, or they have global investors, global lenders, they just don't have a choice. They have to, abide by the best-in-class sustainability principles. But here the challenge is that if you are local and nobody is demanding, if the regulators are not demanding, the financial institutions, the investors are not demanding, now how much of sustainability do you imbibe? So that's one question. The second issue is, again, I'm saying it with a lot of responsibility, is the recent CSR Act. It's not recent anymore. That's led to a lot of confusion in the Indian market, especially within the government, as to what CSR and sustainability means for Indian corporates and Indian businesses. Because a lot of compliance effort, a lot of corporate governance effort is into monitoring as to how that 2% of the profit is spent. It's not into how a corporate or a business makes its money, which is the core to sustainability. Is how you make your money, how sustainable are you, so far as the environment or society is concerned. Now, that leads to a lot of confusion in the Indian market when you're talking to different stakeholders, including corporates, because they claim, look, we have spent a 2% on education, health, or whatever, and see what a good company we are, how sustainable we are. So that's another, issue I think we need to address, and there needs to be a very strong kind of a movement led by the regulators, the government, and the industry bodies on sustainability aspects. Thank you, Pawan.
Thank you for coloring that. Thank you for coloring that. I'm going to come to you, Sachin, if you don't mind. As we look at a lot of publicly traded firms, and Arindam did mention also that a lot of companies so far are usually the usual suspects that we see as doing good on corporate governance, and we see all these firms. You look at their annual reports and they seem pristine. There are no gaps. And investors are happy to invest in them. But when we go deep into the supply chains, at times we find a gap between ground realities and corporate reporting that ends up happening. Can you share any examples that you may have come across between corporate reporting and ground action? And then, obviously, I'm trying to highlight what are gaps that they may be there, and then figure out how can we address the gaps. But other examples that you may have come across in your work.
Sure, thank you. So our annual reports or sustainability reports are of course very verbose. They've more or less also become documents of good PR, and they of course conceal a lot more than they should ideally reveal. So I empathize with all those people who have to go through lots of these pages and try to look for the answers to their questions. They actually find very little. And I absolutely agree with Arindam that a lot of issues are actually in the supply chain. I mean, there was a time not too long ago, we used to talk about the multinationals, that they've exported their social and environmental problems to the developing countries. What we now see within the developing countries, and most certainly in our country, is that our domestic companies have also exported a lot of their share of the problems, externalities to the supply chains. Now, the other issue also is the second and the third tier supply chain, and that's where that yawning gap between claim and reality that you refer to really exists. And this is even in companies that are integrated into the global supply chain. And I have had my share of discussions with these companies where privately they would admit that there are challenges of course varying degrees. Each one has its own unique characteristics. But they do admit that there are challenges, and some of those challenges are also systemic challenges. And then there are challenges which are, how this whole compliance on human rights, let's say, because that's our topic of interest today, in the supply chain, how is that handled within the organization? So human rights is largely looked at by human resources department and or with the sustainability or CSR people. But then your contracts with the supply chain are with another department, the procurement people or similar department. Now your code of conduct is not binding document. So you include the human rights requirements in the code of conduct, but the supplier contract does not necessarily have that, except for saying, or perhaps it's even not there, it's probably in another document or an email exchange that you also need to adhere to the code of conduct, but then there probably is no penalty. Now, even if there was a clause on penalty, or there was some liability imposed on the supplier, it's very unlikely that it would get exercised, because where are the alternates? And whether the next alternate is better than the current alternate, because mind you, the supplier is currently on board after having gone through the due diligence, including a human rights due diligence. So, and I think, again, going back to what Arindam mentioned, that collaborative effort with the management. So just the way his bank has a collaborative effort with the management, a lot of these large companies actually say that, they have discussions with the suppliers, the management of the suppliers, so that they can walk along and ensure that, some of these gaps are addressed. So yes, the gaps are largely in the second, third tier supply chain. There are still a lot of issues with labor, especially also forced labor and child labor. And that is a reflection of the high degree of informality of employment in the supply chains. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I mean, clearly the supply chains are a big unknown and a big source of challenge. Bharti, I know you have worked pretty extensively on the supply chain. I'm wondering, we just heard Sachin share a few things. One is obviously the supply chain is a nice way, or the suppliers are a nice way for companies to outsource their challenges or outsource their externalities. Um, and I think the lens of obviously the code of conduct being non-binding and having different departments being take care of different things. So obviously within a corporate itself, there's some work that needs to happen. But within the supply chain and the work that you've been doing, are there examples where you see challenges which which are gaps that can be addressed or which need to be addressed?
Thanks, Pawan. And yes, I think Sachin and both Anindam also raised very important points. The issue of informality is very critical when we speak about South Asia. We have, a large informal economy, and most of the initiatives that relate to sustainability or human rights or labor rights usually confine to the upper tiers of the supply chains, whether they are domestic supply chains or they are global supply chains. And they do not actually reach the precarious subcontracted workers who have low skills, who are invisible, who are hidden in the lower tiers of the supply chain, often comprising of migrants, women, people from excluded communities who work with low wages, undecent working and living conditions, issues of health and safety, long working hours, non-payment of full wages. But what we've also seen is that despite the efforts by tripartite partners and civil society initiatives and multi-stakeholder initiatives, when we talk about promoting decent work for all, most supply chain initiatives, are limited to formal sector, which are only responsible for 40% of the jobs worldwide. 60% of the jobs are in the micro, small, and informal sectors. So the most disadvantaged groups actually remain unreached and invisible in these supply chain efforts. And we also know that small and medium sector enterprises contribute to these supply chains. They are the backbones of these supply chains. They offer flexibility. They offer higher returns and profits, and you can give out the skilled work to experts who can do this work in the supply chain. But the issue is that what kind of employment is being generated in these small and micro enterprises, and this COVID-19 pandemic actually has shown the faults. It has thrown open all the faults. If we look at the supply chains, we also have very invisible and hidden workers in the form of home workers or home-based workers. A recent report of the ILO says that there are around 260 million home-based workers who are connected to different supply chains, which is around 8% of the global employment. So how do we really reach these lower tiers, and how do sustainability efforts look at the issue of informality? We need to understand how big is the size of informal economy, and what kind of formalization approaches are needed to actually make changes to have an inclusive economic growth and increasing the revenue base and development, and making sure that workers get legal recognition, protection, rights, and benefits. But at the same time, enterprises also receive benefits, incentives, and protection that come with formalization. So we need to look at the diversity of situation here. What are the needs and policy responses that we need for different kinds of workers and different types of economic units that operate within the informal sector? And we need to give special attention to the most vulnerable population, which is hidden and suffer the most serious deficits. So ILO does have this recommendation 204, which talks about transition from informal to formal economy. It is a 2015 recommendation, and this one recommendation is widely supported by employers, workers, as well as the governments, because it helps to look at the cost-benefit analysis of formalization from a worker, enterprise, and the government point of view. It talks about taking away the negative aspects of informality, at the same time ensuring that livelihoods and entrepreneurships are not destroyed, and there is a sustainability in terms of business. It also looks at how governments can actually make more money by imposing taxes through formalization. To the businesses, it gives a level playing field. It allows them to have competitions in a fair manner. And for the unions, it basically means formalization of the rights of the workers and enabling their rights. So the question is, how do we ensure that the sustainability efforts do not remain confined to the upper tiers or the big formal units, but actually translate and go deep down and have an equitable distribution, and accountability and responsibility is distributed across the supply chains. I think Anindam raised a very important point, is that we need to go beyond the national legislations. National legislations do not cover the informal economy workers. So the businesses may not be required to actually have, provide them with the legal rights. But the question is, how do we expand it? How do we make sure that our business and supply chains are sustainable? The micro, small enterprises, or the informal workers, or the home-based workers who are connected to these supply chains also get the benefits, because that's where most of the decent work deficits, forced labor, child labor exist. So I think that's very important to look at the sustainability initiatives. Thanks.
Awesome. I think that's brought an entirely new dimension to this. I mean, we've just been discussing supply chain from a lens of, in its and thinking that it's a tier 3, tier 4 issue. But this level of informality that actually cuts across, and the points that you're highlighting in terms of potential benefits of bringing the informal sector into the mainstream. How can that happen? And the informal sector really being neglected, or informal sector really being where the issues are. How do you? I mean, that really is a challenge, isn't it? Namit, you've been seeing some of these aspects up close as well. I'm curious. How do you bring the informal sector into other reporting frameworks that can sort of touch upon or bring some of that in, and can make information available from the sector? Has any work happened on that front?
Thanks, Pawan. And I think I'll also just build on what Bharti, Sachin, and Arindam have just said. And I think from a disclosure point of view, it's really difficult to expect now and also in the near future that companies will be in a position to give finer details of what are the issues in their deep supply chains and what are the actions and how are they kind of dealing with that, which is where I think it's important for some of the other stakeholders. Civil society and trade unions obviously play a very, very important role in that to highlight what are these gaps. And benchmarks or standards and agencies like ours working closely with some of these civil society organizations who are closer to the ground, uh, it perhaps gives some understanding, a better understanding of what are the potential risks beyond what the companies have reported. Uh, in terms of also looking at solutions, building on what has already been said about the fact that national legislations are not important. Therefore, how can we look at more operational level policy frameworks? And in most developing countries, especially in the context of India, the state capacity at the front line is very, very weak. There are already some laws that exist which can take care of labor rights violations and other human rights violations. But when you go deep down in those supply chains, what is the awareness that the workers and communities have? What is the access for any sort of remedy? The labor officers have a ton of things to do, and it's very, very impossible for, say, an informal worker somewhere in tier 3 or tier 4 to access some of those complaint mechanisms. So working with the local government at the very, very front line to build capacity and awareness at that level is significant. And I think the large companies, for whom we rely much on the disclosure data, it is very hard to see what's happening in deep supply chains and take action at that level. Therefore, having some collaboration and cooperation with local agencies, whether it's local industry associations, local governance structures, civil society at the grassroots, to find some of those solutions. I think that is not happening at this point of time. In my conversation in multi-stakeholder forums, like Arindam said, a lot of companies will acknowledge that yes, there are issues, but everybody will have a very different take of how to deal with these issues, because these are very, very challenging problems. If companies start doing human rights due diligence now, they will be afraid that what do we do with that kind of explosive information? There will probably be child rights and other labor rights and human rights exploitation in the supply chain. There is no way that the management of a company will allow, say, a human rights officer or a sustainability head to disclose these information in their annual report, because there is this sense of fear. As a society, we are more tuned towards an audit culture. We only report things when things are absolutely clean, and we don't have to take accountability of those things. But I think that needs a shift in mindset, that it's about taking some sort of a commitment, a plan of action, and saying that, okay, in the next so many years or in this time frame, we will be able to address these challenges. And these are all systemic issues. One company cannot solve it. They will have to open up to their peers and competitors and find those solutions. So I think it's a long answer. It's a complicated one, but I think it's not just about looking at reporting, but getting into local action and local cooperation, Pawan.
No, that's totally with you on that. I think the need to actually go beyond the audit culture and actually share information is going to be pretty challenging. And I think it goes back to what's a catalyst? Is a catalyst is policy the driver over there, or are civil society organizations the drivers over there, or is it just multiple drivers and then things coming to a head? Pradeep, I'm going to request you. This is an area that I know you all have been focusing on, and you personally have been looking at for a long time. I'm curious, how do you see the role of civil society organizations, or just even other multi-stakeholder platforms to actually address this challenge of making information more transparent and not just about sharing the rosy picture. I think as we've been discussing, I think it's come up a few times.
Absolutely, I think I will build on what Bharti said, and so Sachin shared a little on that. Is that pandemic has exposed the stark reality of the human rights violation. So a recent study which done by Collect Initiative very clearly says that almost 19%, only the 19% of workers received full wages during the first and second lockdown, and it increased to 42% by September, and almost 57% had to rely on loans. And of that, around 12% were taking loans even from employers and contractors, which means it's a potential bonded labor thing. And 54% workers agreed that the children might enter into remunerative occupations. So this is the reality with which we are seeing. And there is also an incidence where some of the Tamil Nadu NGO alliances, they brought together, complained to the companies, and they brought Tamil Nadu Alliance, they brought workers some wages at that time. And when, as you pointed out in your presentation, Pawan, that the functional grievance redressal system is almost literally non-existing for child labor and bonded labor, so zero. So the non-functional redressal system is a way by which the companies literally close their eyes to what is happening in their supply chain. It would be difficult to argue that it is not a deliberate abandon by them, right? Like, it won't be a surprise if even the compensation which the Tata Steel announced for the families of the employees facing debt due to COVID pertains only to their permanent employees. So the companies have stopped looking at the supply chain as probably their important part of their thing, right? So now, as a civil society, there is a two civil society. One is really working on the human rights aspect of it, and others are somebody who is trying to convince the investing community that you have to be sensitized to ESG. So we all go by certain assumptions that we need to challenge ourselves. One assumption we all carry is investors are to be sensitized of ESG. If done, they would change. Investors are not aware of what is happening in the company's supply chain. We all know that investment itself is a big industry, and there is a lot of investment on research which goes, and therefore investors, if they really want to know, they will know what the supply chain of a firms are. Second is that human rights violations are themselves occurring despite companies and investors want to be ESG friendly, is another assumptions with which many of us go with, right? And in this scenario, I would say I would refer to one of the interesting study which was done by actually Benjamin Page in US, where he interviewed around 83 wealthy persons among the top 1/10 of the 1% of the wealth holders in USA. And what he found is that their engagement with political activities is very high. Almost 84% are participating. They believe budget deficit as their most important consideration. And for them, the improving infrastructure is decided as the high spending activities. And they do not believe in any system of the, with respect to redistribution of the wealth or anything. They also felt that a hedge fund manager should earn 54% less, and the CEO has to earn 43% less, and a skilled worker should earn 43%. So the study actually gives you a profile of the the high end investors whom we are trying to talk about. So now if you come back to these questions, that whether these what is important for them, I think you brought in two risks which you presented in your presentation. One is the financial risk, and another is the reputational risk. Now the idea is to see that whether any of these risks related to environment protection or labor rights are not among their priorities is because they are not yet a macroeconomic parameter or the policy shifts which the investor wants to push on. So one may immediately construe that investor being unaware or insensitive is the reason. I would challenge that. That is not the way we should go, because what is they are not just investors, they are also active influencer of policies. A number of tips happening as of the very significant part of that investors. Further, a government who is desperate, which is desperate of investment, could also be part of this complicity. So we need to understand the entire political economy with which the investing community and investor as a profession operates. So if you see, they do have mechanisms like ease of doing business index, right? Now the World Bank created index cannot not be an outcome of the influence of the investor. And I'm sure the ILO, UN agencies, global CSOs, trade unions, we have all been fighting for including one indicator on labor rights or human rights in that index. Are we really successful on that? Therefore, at this point of time, I would push the civil societies at this point of time to actually look at some of our assumptions with which we are operating. But at the same time, I would also say investors is not a monolith. There are ESG investors, but even those ESG investors are needing, or they are demanding a fair competition environment. Otherwise, they would also disappear. They would not survive. So therefore, there is an important need for getting certain macroeconomic policy shift back into these debates on the investors. The documenting good practices of investing communities is a thing which can go on, but let us not forget the core advocacy role of the CSOs, which is to find out how to influence government to make certain important policy shifts or reclaim some of the legislations which we have lost in the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. And I think that's a good segue towards, I think, the concluding part of our panel. And I'm also looking at several of the questions that have come in, because what you were just commenting on was beginning to talk about recommendations on what's possible. The couple of things, one is whether it's documenting good practices with investors, or the role of CSOs, or the CSOs playing a more of an advocacy role. The question is which areas. And so I'm looking at some of the questions that have come in. And given I think we have about 8 minutes, but let's spend 5 minutes on really coming up with recommendations. And I'm going to pose the question as follows, because several of the questions that have come in really pose it and say, what's your proposal or recommendation on a few key issues? And so I think and maybe we can just go in turns. Arindam, would love to start with you. If what can be done to motivate companies or investors more, or what are other recommendations that you may have to address some of the gaps that we've discussed, whether the gaps have been around bringing the informal sector into the formal sector, or working more with the extended supply chain, or solving the confusion between CSR and policy. I think we've discussed a number of issues and gaps that have been there. So if you could just share your thoughts in a minute or so, that'll be awesome, and then we can get other views as well.
Sure, thanks, Pawan. I think Pradeep hit the nail on the head. Now, recently I participated in a FAO webinar on climate action and climate financing. And there was a research which was done, and it said that 68% of the corporates who take climate action, which is nothing but sustainability, is because of regulations. That's extremely important, that it's regulation across the world which is leading to sustainable action. It's not that we want the world to be a better place for our children. That is not motivating, unfortunately not motivating most of the corporates and businesses. That's what we are finding. Number two is technology is critical as an enabler because it cuts down on cost, sustainability, reporting. Understanding the supply chain is a very expensive affair. And the moment there's a cost to it, corporates shy away. Technology could be an enabler to address the cost issue. And third is the new generation, the younger generation. During my time in school and college, there was zero discussion on sustainability. But now in every school, every college, they are discussing. And I do see the younger generation being more demanding about services and products from a sustainability perspective. I think that's the bright spot. Thank you.
Thank you. That was short, sweet, crisp, and perfect. Namit, if I can come to you, again, your thoughts as well in terms of recommendation, and especially if you have any recommendations on standardized information or benchmarking, that will also be particularly helpful.
Thanks, Pawan. And just a couple of points. One, in terms of the disclosures and standardization, I think what's important is that the frameworks become more forward-looking, so that it allows companies and others to shift from that audit approach, and they are able to bring in much more of their vision. What are their thoughts of changing the status quo? I think that's going to be significant. But we are also seeing a lot of collaboration between investors, governments, and corporates. I agree with Pradeep that not all the investors and all organizations and stakeholders are on the same page, but I think that is important. And at least in this region, we are seeing that there is a tipping point of these collaborations, converting into something much more practical, hands-on, and something that becomes actionable. What's important is that the data that is available becomes more reliable, comparable, and consistent. I think that is the biggest challenge. And I think what Sachin alluded to, that it's so hard to find answers in those sustainability reports. I think it needs to shift away from being just a communication document to something more of a dialogue. How can companies open up dialogue with all the stakeholders, like they have dialogue with investors? Can they also start looking at the whole concept of stakeholder capitalism? It's being promoted every now and then, but how do you actually action on those stakeholder capitalism principles? What are the dialogue platforms there? And I'm also quite personally quite disappointed with the skewed uptake of ESG, from the investor and the policy front, with social lagging behind. Until and unless there is a balance between E, S, and G, we are not going to make an impact. So I think, just concluding thoughts, we've seen some of those systemic vulnerabilities coming out through the pandemic. And right now is the best time for governments, investors, and civil society to work towards addressing some of these systemic concerns. And hopefully, through dialogue and through consultations, things will improve both at the policy level, but also at the action and impact level.
Thank you, Namit. I appreciate that. Pradeep, if I could get your thoughts on recommendations.
I think I'll go back to that, for some reason, it's a 2013 study by Benjamin Page in US, but I feel some of the insights are useful for our discussion. It also said like around 24% of those investors who are relatively more environment friendly or social security workers friendly, they come from a community, from so-called what he classified as professional background, which is doctors, lawyers, etc. I somewhere have a feeling that there is an education and influencing the management school, management students at this point of time is a very significant thing to do. Primarily to say that even if the human rights risk has a cost, it is non-negotiable. That kind of a thing has to get into so that the business students who come from there are the champions for the human rights. That is something which we have to build on it. Second one, which I feel is also about the fact which Arindam said, that I feel that like many instruments which are coming, like NGRBC or BRRs, which are all coming into it, there is a need to make it mandatory. That has to be part of the regulatory system of it, because we have seen, if I'm not mistaken, the AXA the financing has a no tobacco policy, has a no tobacco signatory globally. But within India, with Aksabharti fund, it is no longer adhering to that particular thing. So therefore, the problem today is how to ensure that India is a destination of ESG friendly investors and the companies by changing certain by bringing in certain regulatory standards itself. So in that way, I would definitely pitch for more regulations at this point of time, especially emanating out of RBI for various banks and financial institutions. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. Bharti, if I may bring you in, I know we're at time, but if we could just get your closing thoughts, and then Sachin as well, and we'll wrap it up on recommendations.
Thanks, Pawan. I think the companies are now increasingly pressured to become sustainable, and they are considering triple bottom lines. But the question is that are disclosures a complete necessity, or companies should do it because they need to be responsible and because it is the right thing to do. And if the companies don't look at sustainability, they are actually taking a huge business risk, and so are the investors who invest in these companies. We also know that the future of work and business, it seems like a very abstract concept, but the kind of changes and the exponential rate at which these changes are happening today, such questions are very impossible to ignore. We have technological changes, going integration of the global economies. We have transformation of jobs, markets, demographic change, climate change. So all these call for greater sustainability, and therefore the companies need to look at how they can work together. And ILO has been talking about using social dialogue as an approach, looking at the global agenda and mandate and transforming and contextualizing it in the national context with the participation and adaptation of this global agenda with the help of unions, employers, workers, and the civil society, and trying to create horizontal and vertical linkages between existing resources and structures, at the same time enabling inclusion, diversity, and using a multi-pronged comprehensive approach. ILO has been talking about principles of partnership which are tripartite, value-based, and mandate-driven, so that we can have full involvement of workers, employers, and governments, as well as the interest groups, to enable sustainability. Last thing that I just want to say is that ILO also set up a global commission on future of work, which talks about human-centric approach, especially looking at the future of work. And that global commission has talked about three major pillars of action, which alone would drive the growth, equity, and sustainability for present and future generations. And it calls for increasing investment in people's capacities and capabilities, increasing investments in the institutions of work, and third is increasing investments in decent and sustainable work. And I think this is what is required when we talk about transformative investments, and they align with the UN Agenda 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Thanks so much.
Thanks for the thought on social dialogues and enabling that, Bharti. Sachin, you get the last word in. Your thoughts and recommendations.
Thank you. What I would say is that we need to take a pause and look at whether increasing the number of disclosures is really the solution at this stage, when we are also debating that the quality of the existing disclosures itself needs to improve. We are in the process of a reporting season. Let's look at those annual reports and sustainability reports as they come out, and try to focus on how the companies have calculated and articulated the impact of just the movement of labor that happened last year, how that has impacted their business. And going forward, as these people come back to the shop floors and air-conditioned offices, what is the lingering risk on business? Now, if the companies have described this, not necessarily in pages, but articulated this quite sharply, I think we are making progress. If we are not, then that emphasizes the point that I just said, that it's not more disclosures, but it's really the quality of disclosures that really need to become more important.
Excellent. Thank you, Sachin. That's a voice of reason saying, let's, given what everybody's gone through over the last year, let's see what businesses actually report as their true risk because of the 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 lack of having labor, or just the entire dysfunction that happened in society, and see whether it's therefore the quality of disclosure that needs to be enhanced. And let's look at what happens as a consequence of the data that's provided in this earnings season. Hear you on that. Again, this can be a very long conversation. I think we've touched on a number of issues, from what's the need for disclosure, what are the gaps that exist, and how we can remedy that. Thank you, all of you, for your time. Thank you, all of you, for your thoughts. It's a very rich conversation. It can go on, and would like to thank the organizers for hosting this conversation. And again, thank all of you for participating. Thank all the attendees for patiently listening to us. And again, I look forward to connecting with each of you to build on this offline. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day, and thanks once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.